Hey math enthusiast, I'm here to go over the notes for section 7.1, which deals with ratios and proportions. First couple things you need to know is that a ratio is just a comparison of two or more numbers or quantities. So for example, if you have a record on your sports team of 10 and 2, so 10 wins to 2 losses, that's a ratio right there. It's comparing two numbers to one another. All right, ratios should also be expressed in simplest form. So I could actually change this ratio to 5 to 1, which is telling me that for every 5 wins I have 1 loss. The last thing is there's a couple different ways to write it. So you can use the colon in between, which I did up here and down here. You can write the word 2 in between if you want to, or you can kind of write it like a fraction. All right, as long as you understand that it's not a fraction, it is a ratio. For this first example, they give me a list of instruments at this music store. So we got trumpets, clarinets, violins, flutes, trombones in stock. And I want each ratio in simplest form. So for A, I'm comparing trumpets to violins. So if I go back to my list, for trumpets, I have 40. So it's going to be 40 to violins, which is 24. Now, what I want to try to do is reduce this. All right, it looks like 40 and 24 are going to be both divisible by 8. So my final ratio is going to end up being 5 to 3. And I also want to include my units here. All right, remember I'm comparing trumpets to violins. So for every 5 trumpets I have, there's going to be 3 violins. That's what I'm saying in this ratio. For B, now I'm comparing flutes. So let's go figure out how many flutes I have to clarinets, 39 clarinets. So I know my ratio is going to be 51 to 39. So now, once again, I want to try to reduce this if possible. Looks like I can divide both of them by 3. So that's going to leave me with 17 to 13. And once again, I want to include my units. So it's 17 flutes to 13 clarinets. For C, now I'm moving on to... Now my next ratio is a little different because it's trombones and violins together. So if I go back to my list, trombones and violins. So that total is going to be 16 and 24 together. So I know for my first part of my ratio, it's going to be 40. And I'm going to compare that to trumpets. So I'll go back to my list, and it looks like for trumpets, we have 40. Well, it looks like this one will obviously reduce down. I can divide both of them by 40, which is going to leave me a 1 to 1 ratio. And then when I add my units, trumpets and violins, and then the denominator, or the second part of my ratio, is just trumpets. And the last ratio is comparing violins. So violins, we have 24 of them. And we're going to compare that to the total instruments. So that's going to be the 40 trumpets, the 39 clarinets. I'm going to include the 24 violins because that's part of all the instruments. And now I'm going to add up all these values that I do have. So 40 and 39, 24 and 51, and lastly 16. Which gives me 170 for my total. And finally, for simplest form, it looks like my only common factor between these two is going to be 2. So my final answer is going to be 12 to 85. And then for my units, so the 12 came from the violins, and then the 170, remember, came from the total instruments. So the total. For these next couple problems, I'm doing the same thing. I'm going to simplify my ratios, all right, but I may need to convert them so that they're in the same units. Okay, so for example, for E, I'm dealing with 7 quarts and 550 gallons. So I want them either both in quarts or both in gallons. The rule of thumb for this is always go with the smaller of the two units. So I'm going to keep this as 7 quarts. And I want to change that 550 into quarts. Now, what you need to know is that 1 gallon is going to be equal to 4 quarts. So in order to convert that, if I have 550 gallons, I'm going to multiply it by 4, and that'll tell me how many quarts are inside that. So if I do that, I'm going to end up with 2,200 quarts. Now, when I compare these two, 7 and 2,200, there's no common factor, obviously because 7's prime. So I'm just stuck right here. This is my final answer. 7 quarts to 2,200 quarts. For F, it's the same issue. I'm dealing with inches and feet. As I said, let's keep the smaller unit. All right, so I'm going to keep this as 10 inches. And I want to change my 2 feet into inches. Okay, well, I know that 1 foot is equal to 12 inches. So that means that 2 feet then is going to be 24 inches. It looks like we can simplify this one. I can divide both my terms by 2. So that's going to give me 5 over 12. And remember, my units are inches for both the numerator and denominator. Next one, I'm dealing with hours and days. Once again, let's stick with the smaller unit. So I'm going to keep the 80 hours. And I want to figure out, okay, well, 2 days then is how many hours? You got to remember that 1 day is equal to 24 hours. So 2 days then is going to be double that, which is going to be 48. Once again, I can reduce this. I can divide both of these terms by 16, which is then going to lead me to 5 over 3. So 5 hours to 3 hours. Last one goes with weight, ounces and pounds. An ounce is smaller, so I'm going to keep the 10 ounces in the top part of my ratio, and I want to change that 3 pounds to ounces. So once again, we need to know how much is in 1 pound. So 1 pound is actually 16 ounces. So that means in 3 pounds, I'm going to end up with 48 ounces. All right, they're both even, so I can at least divide by 2, which is going to give me 5 to 24. Looks like that's as far as I'm going. And once again, both my units here are ounces. So most of the ratios we've seen up to this point are pretty basic, just comparing two numbers. But we're eventually going to come across extended ratios where I'm comparing 3 different numbers. All right, so let's say maybe now your record for your team is 10, 2, and 1. Okay, so once again, the 10 represents your wins, 2 represents your losses, and that 1 at the end represents how many times you've tied. So that would be an example of an extended ratio comparing 3 items. It could be more than 3, though. So for this first example, I have my ratio 3 to 7 that represents 2 complementary angles. First thing you have to remember is that complementary means 90. So I'm talking about 2 angles that equal 90. And the clue is that the ratio is 3 to 7. Now, this does not mean that I'm just going to do 3 plus 7, because clearly that does not equal 90. But since they gave me a ratio of 3 to 7, what they're saying is that whatever my angle measures are, they're going to reduce down to this. So maybe my angles are 6 and 14, because that would reduce down to 3 and 7. Well, the problem is that does not equal 90 if I add those two up. So what I need to figure out is what are they multiplying by that's going to get them to 90. So it's really going to be 3 times some number and 7 times some number. And together, those two are going to equal 90. So now I can go through and simplify this. Obviously 10x equals 90, x equals 9. So that means my two angle measures, remember it was 3x and 7x, are going to be 27 and 63. Those two, if I add them up, I am going to get 90. And if I reduce this ratio, then it's going to lead me back to what I had initially. So for J, use what we did back in I to help you solve. But now you're dealing with supplementary angles, so you have to remember that they add up to 180. Take a second, try it on your own. I'll reveal the answer in a couple seconds. So my two angle measures are 144 and 36. If I divide both of these by 36, that's going to give me 4 to 1, which brings me back to where I started with the ratio they give me. Now we come across an extended ratio. So 4, 7, and 9 represent the angles in a triangle. And I want to just find the measure of the largest one. Now, first thing you need to remember is, well, what's special about the angles in a triangle? All right, well, they add up to 180. And in this case, the ratio is 4 to 7 to 9. Now, once again, I'm not saying that 4 plus 7 plus 9 is going to equal 180, because it does not. So obviously my angle measures are not 4, 7, and 9. But remember, there's some multiple of 4, some multiple of 7, and some multiple of 9. So maybe it's like 8, 14, and 18 if I just doubled them. Well, once again, I can check to see, are these three going to add up to equal 180? Because they're supposed to represent measures of a triangle. They don't. So I'm going to have to solve this one like I did for the last problem. So it's a multiple of 4, it's a multiple of 7, it's a multiple of 9. If I add all three angles up, I know it's going to equal 180. Well, I end up with 20x equals 180. And it looks like x equals 9. So then that means that my angle measures are going to be 36, 63, and 81. If I happen to add up those three angle measures, I do in fact get 180. And if I were to simplify that ratio, it's going to bring me right back to where I started, 4 to 7 to 9. Now the next one for L is very similar. All right, they give me my extended ratio, 289, but now these are the ratio of the measure of the sides of a triangle. Well, the sides might equal 180, but there's no guarantee. All right, that's only true for the angles like we had in the last problem. In this case, though, they do specifically tell me my sides are going to add up to 76, because that's what the perimeter is. So think about what we did for the last problem, and now I'm using 76 instead as my total. Take a second, try this problem on your own. I'll reveal the answer in a couple seconds. So my three side lengths are 8, 32, and 36. If I add them up, I do get my perimeter, of 76. And if I were to reduce this ratio, it is going to go back to 2, 8, and 9. Now for M, I'm dealing with the area of a room. So let's say this is my room, and I know the area is 180 square feet. Next thing they tell me is the ratio of the width to the length is 5 to 4. So I'm going to write that down here, width to length, because that order is important, is 5 to 4. Now, once again, I'm not necessarily saying that my side length here is 5 and my side length here is 4. All right, because you have to remember that the formula for the area of a rectangle is length times width. Well, if I were to do 4 times 5, I'm definitely not going to get 180. So, what you need to remember is that it's going to be a multiple of 5. It's going to be a multiple of 4. Okay, so maybe, for example, it's like 8 and 10. All right, but now when I plug them in here, remember, it has to give you 180. This does not. So instead of guessing and checking, since it's a multiple, I'm going to use what I wrote here, 4x and 5x. So that means it's going to be 5x times 4x. And I already have my area. They told me it's supposed to work out to be 180. Well, multiply these two together. 5 and 4 gives me 20. Remember that x times x is going to give me x squared. And it equals 120. You're also going to have to remember to solve these problems. I can divide both sides by 20, which gives me 9 equals x squared. Last thing I do to get rid of that square, take the square root on both sides. So x equals 3. So now that means that my side lengths are actually going to be 12 and 15. If I multiply those two, I do get 180 for my area. And if I reduce that ratio, 15 to 12, I am going to get back to 5 to 4. N is very similar, but now it's dealing with the perimeter. It's telling me it's 280 feet. And once again, they give me my ratio. Remember, my ratio is width to length for 11 to 9. So, once again, remember that it's a multiple of 11 and it's a multiple of 9. I'm just not sure what I'm multiplying both those terms by. So, the one thing you're going to have to remember is how to calculate perimeter. Perimeter would be all the way around my rectangle. All right, well, to figure that out, I'm going to need double the length plus double the width. That'll account for all my sides. So now what I'm going to do, instead of writing L and W, I'm going to replace it with the 9x and 11x. So now my new side of this equation is going to be 2 times 9x plus 2 times 11x. And once again, I have my perimeter. They already told me that P equals 280. So now I'm just going to have 280 equals 18x plus 22x. 280 equals 40x. So it looks like x equals 7, which tells me right away what my numbers, or what my length and width are going to be. If I plug 7 in here for x, I'm obviously going to get 77 and 63. If I plug them into my formula for perimeter, I am going to get 280. And then the last thing you would want to include is your units, which is kind of hard to squeeze in here. So remember, this is 77 feet and 63 feet.